Dr Philip Pratt is co-founder of Medical iSight, a company that brings augmented reality into the operating theatre. He has a PhD in neural systems engineering from Imperial College London, and after a career as a quantitative analyst, he was appointed as a research fellow at the Hamlyn Centre for Robotic Surgery. We discussed the technology behind this tool and future implementations it may have to improve surgery. So, can you outline your career path to where you are now?
So, going back to my time at university, so I originally studied mathematics at Imperial College, and after that I stayed at Imperial to do a PhD, not in mathematics, but in it was actually the electronic and electrical engineering department, because that was where there was a group looking into neural networks, and I had a passion about that subject, even for my days in school. So it was my dream to do some research in that area. And of course, nowadays, neural networks and deep learning and artificial intelligence are all the rage. But this was back, in the late, the latter part of the last century. So this was year 2000. So I was very fortunate to be able to do some research and get a PhD in that area. Then after that, I worked. So I'm actually on to about my third career now. My first job was working in computer graphics and animation, and I did that for 2 or 3 years post PhD. Got a bit fed up with that, and then I actually went to work in the city. So as a mathematician for a number of different investment banks doing risk management and pricing of derivatives and so forth. So it was using my mathematical background to its full extent. So I worked for various different places, including Lehman Brothers actually, when it crashed in 2008. So I was there. It wasn't my fault, but before that event happened, I had decided to get out of that world. It wasn't where I wanted to be for the rest of my career, and so I went back to Imperial College and met up with some people that I sort of knew from my time there as an undergraduate and postgraduate, and kind of got back into doing some research. Initially part-time, so I was working both in the city and at Imperial, and sort of to cut a long story short, sort of coming back up to date, I found myself doing research and eventually moved back to working at Imperial full-time as a senior research fellow, working broadly in the area of image-guided surgery. So initially with devices like the Da Vinci surgical robot, but then more lately with augmented reality devices such as the Microsoft HoloLens, which we can use to give surgeons guidance during other types of procedures, so open procedures, for example.
Fantastic. And can you outline the goals of MediSight and how it hopes to achieve them?
So Medical iSight, which is the startup that I'm one of the founders of. So really, the idea is to take some of the ideas and research that I've been working on for a while and to make them more ubiquitous, so to get them out there and being used, not just in the UK but globally. So the idea is to ultimately to help patients. So what motivates me in doing all of this is the ultimate sort of goal of being able to make a difference to patient outcomes and people's quality of life after different types of surgery, by inventing, if you like, creating new technology to enhance the amazing work that surgeons and practitioners already do, just to make it even better.
And what sort of image additions do Medical iSight tend to provide for surgeons during surgery?
I think probably the best way of characterising it is to say that what we try and do is to make better use of existing imaging modalities. So take CT or X-ray, for example. So CT scans is a volumetric image built up of many different X-rays essentially from different angles. But quite often when radiologists look through those images to interpret them, and surgeons and interventionists also, we're still doing it in what I think is quite an antiquated way. So, we've moved on from holding up films to light boxes, which is the kind of the really old way of doing X-rays. But we're still looking at these images in two-dimensional slices. So they could be axial, coronal, sagittal slices, but we're looking at them in still in black and white, and typically using a mouse or some other device to scroll through them slice by slice, and that's just the way it's done. But can we use new technology to assist radiologists and surgeons and doctors? How can we get that information into their heads in a more efficient way, so that what's going on when we have to make those interpretations of the imaging, it's just so much more intuitive. And I just think we can do better than a screen looking at in slices in black and white. I think the technologies out there that exists today that can make that information transfer. These scanners are incredible. You think how when the first CT scanner, which I think is in the Science Museum, if you look at the picture that first produced, it's very, very blocky and grainy and low resolution. And if you look at a modern CT scanner and the kind of sub-millimetre resolution that we have, the pictures that we get are incredible. And MRI as well. It's amazing. And yet we're sort of not making best use of those images, because we're looking at them in slices in 2D on a 2D screen. I think we can do better than that. So that's a kind of overarching goal of what the company's trying to do. Obviously, you have to take each clinical indication and each particular type of surgery and treat those individually. But that's generally what our sort of mission is in terms of improving use of existing imaging.
Fantastic. And what exact computational technologies does Medical iSight use to overlay these images? So what's going on under the bonnet when you see that?
So one piece of technology we've been using is a device called the Microsoft HoloLens, which came out several years ago now in its first incarnation. So we're now on to version 2, and if you've been following the sort of technology news recently, you'll see that companies like Meta, so Facebook, have produced their own. You can now buy their augmented reality devices, and I think Apple are about to launch their own device as well. So in this, you kind of hear the buzzwords being thrown about, like the metaverse, and people may ask, what is it? Well, one sort of example of that is bringing these types of information or digital assets into a sort of so you're not in a virtual reality, you're in your existing space or workspace, but you're bringing this information as if it were real objects into your own space, that you can interact with them in a much more natural way, ideally. So this can apply to medical images as well. So we're trying to use the HoloLens, which I think at the moment is it's one of the it's probably the best device available. I think there's going to be a lot of competition in this space over the next few years, but at the moment that's the device we're developing for. And the idea is for you to be able to visualize anatomical structures and relationships between imaging and anatomical structures in a native three-dimensional manner. So the good thing about this headset is it shows you, it allows you to visualize things in 3 dimensions. So it renders the information in a stereoscopic manner, so you get a different image for each eye. So things appear to have depth, so they appear like real objects do in your environment. You're not just looking at something on a 2D screen in 3D, if that makes sense. So a lot of problems in medicine are three-dimensional. We have three-dimensional bodies. They have very complicated structures. So it kind of makes sense to try and interact with those visually and in other ways natively in 3D. So that's why we've opted for that as a one way of interacting with this information.
And which type of surgery is the medical iSight device used in most frequently?
So in terms of actual clinical uses versus what we're planning to use it for, I can give you a sort of summary. So I think back in 2018, 2019, myself and some colleagues at Imperial published one of the very first papers on the use of HoloLens and augmented reality in surgery for guidance, and that was for plastic and reconstructive surgery, where you have to raise flaps, so fasciocutaneous flaps. You're sort of transposing a piece of healthy tissue into a damaged site and plumbing in the arteries and vessels, arteries and veins, so that the tissue remains viable. And the key to successful surgery and outcomes for the patient there is to knowing what the vasculature is and in this case it was lower limb surgery. So you really need to know where the perforating vessels are and where you're plumbing these into as part of the surgery. So the traditional way of doing this is to use something called a Doppler ultrasound probe, where you put it on the surface of the skin and it tells you if there's a vessel in the vicinity underneath the transducer, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the depth. So it can be a little bit hit and miss. But with HoloLens, what we did was to put to segment the CT scan. So that means essentially annotating it, converting it into a three-dimensional model. So you've got the skin, the sort of outside of the leg. You've got the bony structures. You've got the vessels, and you highlight where the perforating vessels are. And the simple idea is that what you want to do is to look at your patient on the operating table and essentially have X-ray vision so that you can see inside the leg, so you know exactly where the vessels are, where the perforators are, so you know where to make your incisions, so that you never sort of find that halfway through the surgery that your measurement or your Doppler ultrasound probe is inaccurate, and therefore you have to compromise the quality of the surgery. The idea is you look at the patient and you see inside them. So if you look at that paper that we published, you'll see some images of us precisely doing this. We did a short case series of six patients, but kind of bringing things more up to date. I mean, that was like 5 years ago now. What we're planning to do is to use the technology and the software that they've been developing over the years in a slightly different, completely different field, and that's interventional neuroradiology. So this is where conditions such as strokes or cerebral aneurysms, arteriovenous malformations in the brain are treated not in an open fashion, which may have been the traditional way of doing it, but via a minimally invasive approach where you pass guide wires and catheters and instruments up through the entry point is typically through the groin. You go up the aorta, up the carotid arteries and into the brain. And for example, one of the up-and-coming techniques for treating stroke in large vessel occlusions nowadays is becoming more prevalent, is something called mechanical thrombectomy, which is where you essentially grab hold of the clot and pull it out mechanically. So the issues there are time. So this needs to be done quickly. Every minute, I think 1.9 million neurons die when they're starved of oxygen in the brain. So literally every second counts. So time, speed to get to the point where you've removed the blockage, and also safety are critical in terms of patient outcomes. So we're trying to assist in not just stroke treatments, but also aneurysms, which would be elective cases and other conditions in the brain. So again, the idea is to make better use of the existing imaging technology. So in the brain, these brain procedures, you may have had a a preoperative CT angiogram, or maybe an MRI, and during the operation you'll have live fluoroscopy data. But again, it's presented to the user, or to the surgeon rather, in a not very helpful way. I think so. If you've got biplanar fluoroscopy, which is the norm for this type of surgery, that means you have two live X-ray images taken from different angles, and they're usually at 90 degrees to each other. So you may have one going from left to right, like this, and then one going from top to bottom, to that sort of anterior posterior direction. And yet those two images, which represent information that's essentially orthogonal, they're displayed to the interventionalist on a 2D screen in black and white. So there's that mental mapping that has to go on when they're trying to figure out which direction is up, if you like. In one of the screens it is up. On another screen it might be in or out of the screen because it's effectively at 90 degrees in 3D. So anything we can do to try and again make the passage of information into the operator's brain as smooth as possible, so that it's the path to the target can be got to as safely as possible in as short a time as possible, then that's only going to be good for patient outcomes.
And how do you find the collaboration between your team and the clinicians doing the surgery? As in, do you sort of come up with a prototype and show them, and then do they sort of tell you what features they like and what they don't like, and sort of iterate from there? And generally, how long does that process take?
Yes, that's kind of how it works, and I really it's something I really enjoy doing, is getting into the operating theatres or getting into the angio suites and actually being there and trying to almost stand in their shoes to really appreciate what is the problem we're trying to solve. I think these types of endeavours you cannot do remotely in an office or from home or wherever you happen to work. If you're a technologist or developer like me, you've got to be there and you've got to experience things firsthand to really appreciate what it is we're trying to do. So the way I like to work is in that iterative manner that you've just described. In fact, tomorrow afternoon I'm driving into London with all my kit to set it up, and we're going to do one of these sessions where we iterate. I sort of explain what the developments have been over the past few weeks, and then we sort of plug things in and give things a go. We use phantom models for testing. So these are, in the case of interventional neuroradiology, it's actually a device, like a phantom model of the head with a vasculature. So we can take as many images of this as we want, or we can practice on this using this as much as we want. And for instance, it has a blood vessel network that was 3D printed in silicone from a real patient's CT. So it has the right vascular geometry, if you like, and the gel that vessel network sits in has the same kind of radio opacity as real brain tissue. So it's pretty realistic in terms of the fluoroscopic images that we take. But the advantage is we can use it as many times as we want and practice and then hone the system until, because it has to be. I'm not the user. I'm not writing software for me. I'm writing software for someone else to use. And it's important to get it into their hands as much as possible, because I will make different assumptions to them, and I'm not the one who's going to be using it at the end of the day. They've got to use it and feed back on it, and then I'll make the necessary changes.
And what software do you use for this?
Do you mean the actual software itself, or what software do we use to develop the software?
Both. Let's go with both.
So pretty much all of the application itself is written from the ground up. it's a mixture of sort of rendering technology. So again, my harking back to your first question about my background. So when I did that work on computer graphics and animation post PhD, that's come in extremely handy for this particular part. So 3D visualization, I was able to kind of write all of that bespoke exactly how I wanted it. And the other sort of arm of the software is more numerical. So quite a lot of the things that we're doing are to do with optimization. So what you might be doing is trying to do a what's called a registration. So this is an alignment between a 3D image and a 2D image. So we might have a preoperative scan or model, and we want to work out what the relationship that is in terms of spatial relationship to a two-dimensional image, a projection from an X-ray, and that can be expressed mathematically as an optimization problem. Essentially, what you're doing is you're comparing the real X-ray projection with a virtual X-ray projection, and you're adjusting the parameters of your model. So the parameters of your model will typically be, in this case, to do with rotations and translations in 3D space. So you end up with 6 degrees of freedom that you need to optimize over. And so there are the mathematical or numerical routines that you can use to help you find those minima or maxima by changing those parameters. So that kind of general approach features quite heavily in the software that we've written. And in terms of what software do we use in terms of the development itself, so it's probably best answered by saying that the software is predominantly written in C++ and a language called C#, which is like an evolution of C++ that runs. That's what the HoloLens development is done in, and there are other sort of bits and pieces, some sort of web technology, a bit of sort of cloud infrastructure, and so forth. But it's sort of mostly hardcore C++ and C#, I would say.
Fantastic. And how long was the process between the idea of applying this technology to this problem and then actually having it there in the theatre? How long was that process, and in retrospect, what could have been done to speed it up?
I suppose it's what we've just been talking about in terms of interventional neuroradiology, and I think obviously that's building on some work that's gone on in the past as well. We're not completely starting from scratch, we're just sort of modifying an existing system to cope with that particular specialty and intervention. I would say we've been working on that particular part of it now since the beginning of this year, basically. So I guess we're up to about 10 months now. In terms of how could that process have been sped up, probably with the opportunity to collect more data earlier on. I think we're in a situation now where we need. So one of the reasons I'm going into the hospital tomorrow is to collect some additional data, as opposed to testing the system, because we need to sort of validate it offline and make sure that it performs well enough in all circumstances. So what we must be careful of not doing is creating a system that works very well for one particular data set, but when we show it a novel data set, which is the situation we'll be in when we have real patients, it needs to perform in a sort of robust and uniform manner across a wide spectrum of different data sets with different characteristics. So fingers crossed, the software that we've written will behave in that way, but we've got to do the validation. So had we had more data earlier on, we could have started that process earlier on. Something which we've got to do it. We've got to collect as much data as we can and just test to make sure it's robust.
And the testing that you're doing is comparing the superimposed image that that you're seeing, the image that it's generating versus the scans that were taken. It's comparing those two.
It's checking that it can perform these registrations accurately and in a timely manner. It's all very well in the context of stroke saying, well, I can do a really, really accurate sub-millimetre registration, but it will take 3 minutes. You can't afford to wait 3 minutes. It has to take 3 seconds. So we have to check that we've got the right trade-off between speed and accuracy. There are other things that the software does. For example, it digitizes the fluoroscopy in real time so that it can track information that's going on in those images. So if you've got a guide wire or catheter being inserted, the software will automatically extract that information from those 2D scans, and then it can do things like reconstruct the 3D shape in 3D to tell you where it can triangulate to tell you where you are in a three-dimensional way rather than just kind of giving you a hint in 2D images. So it's doing all of that as well, and we've got to check that we can throw different qualities of image at it, and it will still behave and perform well. There are so many different parameters you can tweak on an X-ray machine, the sort of intensities and how long the exposure is and so forth, that give you images of varying quality in terms of noise. That we've got to make sure it works well across the board, and again that we haven't sort of perfected it for one particular setting, which is no good. It has to work in a very general, robust and safe manner.
And getting more data allows you to make the model more generalizable.
Yes, and we will deliberately try and create a wide range of data sets, not just kind of repeating the same thing over and over and over again in different positions and angles, because that only tests one particular thing. We need to test its robustness versus image noise and other things like that to make sure it behaves satisfactorily. And this is obviously part of the process you have to go through in terms of regulatory approval. So it's all very well being able to write a piece of really useful software for use clinically, but you have to take it through the regulatory process to prove not just to yourself but to what's called a notified or approved body, which is an independent assessor, that your medical device is safe and that it performs in accordance with what you've said it will do. So that this validation is a very important part of that process.
And how does that validation process work? What is the body in the UK that does that? I'm guessing it's some sort of branch of NICE, but who does that process, and what does that process involve?
So the kind of overarching organisation that kind of looks after all of this is the MHRA, so the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, I think that's right. And they approve what's called, I think they were called notified bodies, but they're now called approved bodies, I think. So these are independent organisations that will that you as a medical device manufacturer appoint to essentially audit your work. So there are 3 different classifications of medical device, broadly in line with their sort of levels of risk. So you have Class 1, Class 2 and Class 3. Class 1 are the sort of safest devices, if you like, that probably won't do you much harm if they go wrong. Class 3 devices are things like implantable pacemakers and other things that will have a sort of catastrophic outcome if they fail or if their performance is suboptimal. And Class 2 is somewhere in between. So if you're Class 2 or Class 3, then you have to appoint an approved body to audit your so-called technical file, which is a whole bunch of documentation which goes into not just the validation process we were talking about, but all sorts of other areas in terms of how you've managed the risk associated with your device. So you have to go through all possible outcomes you can think of and try and figure out how likely they are to happen. So you might have a very bad outcome, but it's only going to happen very infrequently, or you might have a sort of an outcome that's bad but not catastrophic, and it happens more frequently. And what you have to do is try and work out, what that sort of risk profile is, and then you have to come up with mechanisms or ways of mitigating those risks. So you have to prove to an independent body that you've considered all of these things, and then we've done something about trying to mitigate those risks, and also assess what the impact of those risks, hazards, if you like, might be. So that's a very important point, a very important part, of that whole process. But there are other things you need to complete as well, in terms of writing a comprehensive documentation for how you use the medical device, and then you have to do a complete what's called a clinical evaluation report, where you provide evidence for clinical safety and performance. So that could either be by looking at what other devices are already being used clinically, what's in the literature, clinical investigations that you may have done with your device to show that it's safe and effective. It's a massive undertaking. I sometimes think that actually inventing the software, writing the software, is the easy part. Doing everything else that you have to do in order to get to actually use it on a patient is much more challenging. And that regulatory part of it is of course only part of the story. In order to do clinical investigations, you have to get ethical approval from a research ethics committee and so forth to do all these types of things. And again, that's quite and rightly so, it's a difficult process, because we want to make sure that everything we're doing is ethical and safe, and that we've always got the interests of the patient at the centre of everything that we're doing. But it's a challenge.
And other than thrombectomy or assisting with mechanical thrombectomy, are there any other procedures that are on the horizons of medical eyesight in the future that you're looking to sort of branch into?
Yes, I think we've chosen this one as I think it's an area where we think we can have make an impact, where it's going to be particularly useful. There are other, if you like, obvious areas of surgery involving three-dimensional structures, where having this again, getting away from the kind of old school way of doing things, where you're looking at imaging slice by slice, grayscale, and moving it to a more sort of contemporary visualization technology, where that could be useful. So I suppose orthopedic surgery is a good idea, because that's a lot to do with geometry. So if you're doing a shoulder repair, so a shoulder replacement, or a hip replacement, or or even redos of these operations where there's diseased tissue or bone that you have to deal with, and it makes everything that much more challenging. Then getting the geometry exactly right, and it's an inherently three-dimensional problem. Getting that right is key to the outcome for the patient in terms of recovering their mobility and their quality of life post-surgery. So that's one. So spinal surgery is another good example. If someone needs a repair to their spine for whatever reason, so maybe scoliosis or a degeneration of the bony structures, and where things need to be fused together or held statically. There's a part of the operation called pedicle screw placement, where you have to make sure you get your entry point and trajectory of a drill hole exactly right, so that it stays within the body of the bone, the vertebra, rather than sort of, if you like, sticking out the side because you got the angle slightly incorrect. And this is particularly important up in the cervical spine, where things get a little bit smaller, and it's obviously a slightly more dangerous area of the body. So being able to do that accurately is again a three-dimensional problem, and we can, with sort of interfacing our software to existing 3D tracking systems, we can present that information in hopefully a more intuitive manner, so that you can line up your the angle of the trajectory of your drill bit or your drill guide, and make sure that you know exactly where how that lies in relation to the vertebra that you're drilling into. In terms of so what you want to be able to do is to pre-plan these surgeries, figure out the optimal trajectories for each of the screws, and then the system will tell you during surgery, when you're perfectly aligned with respect to that preoperative plan. So that's one, if you like, relatively easy application of the software that we're using, that we've developed so far.
Fantastic. Okay, so on to my last question. This is something I ask all my guests. Have there been any books that you found particularly useful throughout your any books that usually they're non-fiction books, but any particular books that you found useful that you've read so far?
Yes. So when I was a child, I don't know where this book came from, but it was on the bookshelf at home, my parents' house, and it's called The Wonderful Story of the Human Body. And I'm not sure who the author is. It's just, all it says in the front is written by a well-known physician, but obviously he wanted to wanted to remain anonymous. But it's a very small book. So I think it must have been written in the early part of the 20th century. But I remember reading it as a child and just being inspired. It's one of these books where all the illustrations are hand drawn. And it is literally a wonderful story, because it sort of opens your eyes to what an amazing thing the human body is, and how it works, and how it's evolved, and all the different systems and how it interacts. And I've still got a copy of it. I sort of keep it very close to my heart, because it's kind of what got me interested in the human body, in medicine, and the whole area, at a very sort of formative stage of my life. And I recommend, it's written in an old style, and the illustrations are sort of dated now, but it's a really good read, and it sort of gets you hooked if you haven't been hooked already. So that's probably, in terms of important books that sort of shaped my life, that I would definitely pick out that one. There are other slightly more technical books, I suppose, that were very important, to do with mathematics, because a lot of what I do is based fundamentally on mathematics. So all of the numerical work that we do is based on kind of maths that's been around for hundreds of years. So going back to the likes of Isaac Newton, and how to minimize or maximize functions, or find roots of functions, and so forth. A lot of this maths is hundreds of years old, but we're still using it to help solve real problems in the world today. So I won't name them individually, but there's a whole bunch of sort of mathsy type books that are critical to what I do, and of course another passion of mine is anatomy. So I've got quite a few anatomy books on the bookshelf. Again, probably too many to name individually, but I really like to to really get into the details of whatever area of medicine we're looking at. I have to know how everything works and the structures and so forth. So the best way is just immerse yourself in a bunch of anatomy books to learn these kind of intricate 3D structures and how everything fits together. Because I think you can only do my job if you have a good appreciation of that.
A big thank you to Dr. Pratt for taking his time. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave a review. Thank you very much, and catch you next time.